All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm happy to welcome to the podcast best-selling historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist H.W. Brands. He's the author of a new book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. H.W. Brands, welcome to the podcast.
Delighted to be with you.
Now, we oftentimes here will do rank punditry. So for those out there watching or listening, we're not talking about Donald Trump's America First. However, there may be some comparisons that one could draw. But we're talking about this movement in the 1930s and early 40s to keep America out of World War II. Let me ask you this question, because I think that right now, when we think of America First, we may think of cranks and anti-Semites, but it was a pretty broad coalition, at least initially. Talk, if you would, who would have been involved in the America First movement early on?
Well, before it was called America First, there was a movement to keep the United States out of foreign wars. And when you ask the question who was involved, the answer is nearly everybody. So in the mid-1930s, there was a consensus that American intervention in the First World War in the 1910s had been a bad idea, that nothing good had come of it. America had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and Europe was not any more stable or peaceful than it had been before. And so Americans took the lesson from that: don't get involved in the wars of Europe, to the point where Congress in the mid-1930s passed a series of laws, aptly called the neutrality laws, that forbade the President of the United States from getting the United States involved in a war, should a war break out. Because in 1935, when the first of the neutrality laws was passed, it seemed clear that Europe was bound for another war. It might be Germany, it might be Italy, it might be Spain. A civil war broke out in Spain. And the overwhelming view of Americans was, that's not our business. That's not our problem. It was a mistake the first time around. It would be an even worse mistake if we get involved the second time around. So that's the group that gave rise to this smaller group called the America First Committee. But that committee was in fact created after the long anticipated war in Europe broke out. The war broke out at the beginning of September 1939, at which point Americans began to think, oh my gosh, okay, this war that we worried about, we saw coming, it's here. Now, most Americans still said, it's not our problem, we don't want a part of it. There were a few people, though, starting with folks in the Roosevelt administration, who said, this really is our problem. Nazism in Germany, Adolf Hitler, and what he stands for is bigger than just Europe. And the argument they made is that if he should conquer Europe, then first of all, that messes up our relations with Europe. But secondly, then he's coming after us. And so this is when the big debate began, because now there's an actual war going on in Europe. And the question is, does the United States get involved or not? And my book focuses on this particular debate. Yeah. And so this is what I like to call the first America First. This is the one. And the position they took was that we are thinking of America first. They were already being called isolationists. Now, in those days, to be called an isolationist was not the kind of real pejorative label it would become. Because isolation is fine. Just as, in fact, the analogy was often used. If an epidemic breaks out in Europe or somewhere, you do indeed want to isolate yourself. We call it quarantine, but it's essentially the same thing. Stay away from bad stuff. But there was this group associated with the Roosevelt administration first that started pushing the United States in the direction of getting involved in the war. Now, they swore up and down that this initial involvement would not lead to American troops in Europe. They said again and again, well, but the first thing we have to do is to repeal the neutrality legislation, because they said it's really working in favor of the aggressors. Germany was already well armed, but countries like Britain and France, they needed to catch up. And the way they would catch up was to buy arms from the United States. So there was that first step. And then there were more steps. And it culminates actually in this 2-year period in this dialogue, debate, this ongoing battle between Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, and Charles Lindbergh. Roosevelt, President of the United States, he's a closet internationalist. He does want to get involved. He believes that what happens in Europe really influences the United States, but he can't say it in public when there's so many people who say, don't do that, don't do that. So he's gradually sort of coming out of the internationalist closet. And Charles Lindbergh happened to be the son of a congressman from the 1910s period, the period of World War I, where his father had said, stay out of war. And he basically got run out of politics for doing it, but turned out to be kind of four-sided. So Charles Lindbergh took up where his father left off.
Yeah, in reading this, I couldn't help, of course, see parallels to today, except maybe they were doing it better. So, for example, FDR, when I was reading this book this summer, Joe Biden wasn't just the president; he was the candidate running for president as the Democratic nominee, presumably. And of course, he's supporting Ukraine against Russia. And so I'm sort of juxtaposing FDR's behind-the-scenes machinations and his rhetoric and persuasion with Biden's. And I think FDR was clearly more persuasive in that regard. And then you look at Lindbergh, who, of course, was famous at this point. And he seemed to be, although he was making this kind of isolationist case, and I think there were some things about him that were sketchy. Like, for example, at one point he said, if the white race were threatened, then maybe we should get involved. So I'm not making him out to be a saint, but compared to like today's right wingers, he seemed to be more virtuous and maybe smarter.
Well, you've hit on something that's absolutely crucial to understanding the difference between then and now. So in those days, the established position, the conventional wisdom is we stay out of other people's wars. Today, the conventional wisdom is if there's trouble in Europe, America needs to get involved. And so it was kind of the natural thing for Joe Biden to do when Russia invaded Ukraine to help Ukraine. The United States had made a point. Well, in fact, since this debate of 1939 to 1941, which focuses on the presidential election of 1940. And so one of the arguments that I make regarding this topic generally is that the last time the United States had a really serious debate about what is America's role in the world, does trouble in Europe mean trouble for the United States? The last time we had this debate was in 1940. And it was a pretty honest and evenly balanced debate because both sides had strong arguments and both sides had strong constituencies. Now, ever since, I'll say, the Roosevelt side won that debate, but they won it in 1941 by virtue of Japan attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor, which seemed to make the case for Roosevelt that he had been saying all along, that these bad actors in international affairs are going to come get us. And they attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Now, one of the things that Roosevelt didn't say was that the United States had been engaged in economic warfare against Japan for a year and a half before that. But anyway, so ever since that moment, and then I should add, so the United States goes to war and the United States defeats the fascist powers and discovers, and this is absolutely crucial in understanding how all this plays out, they discovered how horrible Nazism really was when American troops liberated the death camps and they saw the remains of the 6 million who had been killed. Then all of a sudden, the isolationists, the people who had said we shouldn't get involved, they no longer had a moral leg to stand on. Because, oh my gosh, if anything, we should have gotten involved sooner. And the isolationist side, I should add, isolationism carries this tone of disdain. That if you're an isolationist, you're an idiot probably, and you're probably a neo-fascist or something like that. There's something seriously wrong with you. That wasn't the case in the 1930s, but ever since World War II turned out the way it did, it has carried that label. And so today, people who say that the United States should not get more deeply involved in the war in Ukraine, let's say. If somebody calls them an isolationist, say, no, I'm not an isolationist. But in fact, they're making that argument. So there is, I think, a real timeliness to the story of 1939, 1940, because in this particular election, for the first time, really since 1940, we have two candidates who espouse different worldviews. Because what it really comes down to is, what do you American voters think the role of the United States should be in the world? And until Pearl Harbor, most Americans said, well, we'll take care of things in America. and maybe in Latin America as well, but not in Europe. That's not our problem. Asia is not our problem. Since World War II, the United States, Americans have generally thought, if there's trouble in Asia, we got to deal with it. Vietnam, Korea. If there's trouble in Europe, we have to deal with it. NATO, the war in Ukraine. But for the first time now, we have two candidates, one of whom is seriously challenging that view. Former President Trump has said while he was president, we're going to reconsider NATO. He has talked about ending the war in Ukraine in a day. And the only way it's going to be ended in a day is if he says, okay, we're pulling the plug on American aid and Ukraine, you better make the best deal you can. So there are, even today, it's really hard to argue I'll call it the Trump side without seeming as though you're in that same group as those idiots who were isolationists during World War II. And of course, that's exactly what, I'll call it the folks in the Biden camp, because we don't know exactly what Kamala Harris's position is on this. She hasn't taken a high profile position on international affairs. We'll assume that she's going to, if she's elected, she will certainly inherit the Biden program, but who knows? But anyway, it all comes down to what do Americans think America's role in the world should be? If Americans really think the United States needs to maintain this leadership role in the world so that Americans need to be very concerned about what happens in Ukraine, what happens between Taiwan and China, what happens between Israel and Hamas, all of this stuff, we're sort of kind of on the hook for 3 wars or potential wars. And if Americans say that's what we want, then okay, we're going to go with it. But if Americans say, well, maybe not, then the Trump position looks more appealing.
So one of the things I just loved about this book, you're reading FDR's speeches and addresses, and he's making a compelling intellectual, philosophical case for America being a beacon of hope and internationalism. Then you've got Lindbergh's diary and his radio addresses, and he is making a very smart, compelling, and his allies are making a defensible position of what we would call isolationism. What I didn't know, when I learned from your book, is that Hitler was actually also in this arena, and he's sort of playing what we might call, both-sider, right? He's saying, well, England's bad too. Look at the colonization that they do. He is actually in this debate as well.
Oh yeah. So, and I should add, in the book, I deal Winston Churchill's involved as well, because Winston Churchill, of course, becomes prime minister of Britain early in the war, and so he's speaking. He's trying to get the United States involved in the war. Hitler is trying to keep the United States out of the war because he knows the United States will come in on the side of Britain if it comes in at all. And one of the things that Lindbergh does is to point out the inconsistencies of the Roosevelt position. Because Roosevelt is saying we have to defend democracy. We have to go to the aid of these self-governments that are beleaguered. But Lindbergh points out, well, wait a minute. Britain, okay, they practice democracy in Britain, but they control this worldwide empire. There's no democracy in India. There's no democracy in British South Africa.
Yeah, it's whataboutism is the word I should have used.
Precisely. Yeah. And it gets even more striking when Germany attacks the Soviet Union. And Roosevelt immediately says, okay, now we're going to send American aid to the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union under Stalin is at least as despicable a dictatorship as that of Germany under Hitler. And so Lindbergh points out, okay, if the argument that by going to Europe we will defend democracy was strained before this, now it's utterly absurd. But nonetheless, Roosevelt keeps pressing. And I appreciate your comment about how you read Roosevelt's speeches and they sound really compelling and visionary. And then you read Lindbergh's responses, and dang, that's a pretty good argument too. And this is the point that I'm trying to make in the book, because what's called isolationism has gotten a really bad rap for the reasons that I explained earlier ever since. But there were very sound arguments, and the arguments haven't gone away. And so if this book accomplishes anything, I hope it gets people to sort of think seriously about that particular argument. Is it necessary? Is it advisable for the United States to take this leadership position in the world? American leaders, diplomats, presidents have been saying for years that the United States is the indispensable nation. The world needs American leadership. Well, it's kind of flattering to Americans for somebody to say that, but do Americans actually think that's true, considering the costs that are involved? And, if you sort of look back on America's track record as leader of the world, yes, there has been no World War III. So that's a big deal. But there's been Vietnam. The Korean War was a toss-up. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, those were clearly unsatisfactory. They were defeats. And so, if you put it this way, must America remain the world's cop? If you put it that way, most Americans say, wait a minute, we want to do that. But if you phrase it somewhat differently, say, should the United States continue to maintain a leadership in the world? Oh, well, sure.
Right.
It's sort of all how you phrase it. And whether you emphasize the benefits or the costs.
I really enjoyed reading about Lindbergh. I mean, obviously, most people know more about FDR than they know about Lindbergh. And you hear about things like obviously his baby is kidnapped and murdered. And at a certain point, Lindbergh doesn't like the media. He hates the paparazzi. Apparently there was one occasion where he thought that he might have a chance to rescue his baby. He got a tip or a lead, and the press followed him, which may have scuttled. Who knows if it was real? Maybe but he had this deep distrust and animosity for the press. You also write about how he goes all over Europe, and so Lindbergh really has a better sense of how many planes Germany has and how many planes different countries has. And it seems like he's very sincerely concerned that America doesn't have the fleet maybe that we ought to have, or that certainly that France doesn't have the arsenal that they ought to. So interesting stuff. I assume this diary was publicly available, but just not as widely known, because I had certainly never read some of this before.
Yeah, it was published in the early 1970s. So I think 1972 was the publication date. And well, in fact, he said that, and I think we said it's true up to a point, that we know Roosevelt a lot better than we know Lindbergh. And at a certain level, that's true. Roosevelt was in public. He was president of the United States and all this. But Roosevelt is actually a very hard person for the historian or the biographer to get his hands around, because Roosevelt essentially never bared his soul to anybody. He didn't keep a diary, so he can't read a diary. Whenever he wrote letters, and by the time he became president, he wasn't writing letters much. He talked to people in person. He spoke by telephone, but he didn't write stuff down. And the thing about Roosevelt is he was notorious for telling people sort of what they wanted to hear. And so 3 people could come into Roosevelt's office advocating 3 different approaches to a particular problem. And each one of the 3 walked out thinking Roosevelt had agreed with him. Now, some of it was just a stylistic tick. So Roosevelt would nod and say sort of yes, yes, to get people to continue talking. And they thought, oh, he agrees with me. So I know what Lindbergh was thinking because I'm reading his diary. And this is a diary that pretty clearly reveals what Lindbergh's thinking. It doesn't by no means always put him in the best light. So it's not as though he's writing for posterity to burnish his reputation. With Roosevelt, you have to sort of infer what he's thinking from what he says. But he's one of the shrewdest characters in American politics that I've ever encountered. So, there are a couple of instances where I can get some insight. For example, his son, James Roosevelt, his eldest son, did write a memoir later, and he would relate stories that his father had told him, conversations he had with his father. So there's one sort of crucial moment where at the climax of the 1940 campaign, Roosevelt's running for an unprecedented 3rd term. He's breaking all the rules of American politics to do this. And he keeps reassuring Americans that if he gets elected, this does not mean the United States is getting closer to war. And he finally says in this last rally before, and if I'm elected, I will not send American boys to fight in any foreign war. And his son James was listening, and he asked him later, he says, Dad, why did you say that? You knew that American boys are going to be fighting in a war. And, as soon as Germany did something, American boys are going to say that. And Roosevelt was candid for one of the rare times with his son saying, Jimmy, I know that and you know that. But if I told the American people that, that's all they would have been shouting the whole time. Roosevelt's going to take us to war. And, you know, it just, you got to play politics as it lies, you know? So here's, and this is a critical moment because he says, elect me president for this third time, and I won't send your boys to fight in foreign wars. Well, the first thing that he did upon his re-inauguration was to increase American aid to Britain and other countries fighting the war. And that there's a direct line from that, because if you believe that Britain merits American military aid and American money, and you do it for principled reasons, well, if Britain's about to lose the war, isn't the same principle telling you to send American soldiers? And this, of course, is why President Biden today has to be so careful about what he says regarding Ukraine. Because if you think that Ukraine is really worth defending with hundreds of billions of dollars of American aid, well, what if that aid doesn't do it? What if, Russian soldiers pour in? Then do you say, well, okay, it's, the principle is true up to here, but not beyond that. And this is, I will say this is a common aspect of American policy, that American policy makers insist on making these policies based on principle. We're doing this because it's for democracy, or it's, for a good cause. And once you've made that argument, it's pretty hard to say, well, we'll push it this far, but no farther. Is the cause less good just because Ukraine is about to be defeated? So then, and this is why the United States was fighting in Afghanistan for 20 years. And the argument was, we're trying to help the Afghan people develop democracy. Well, after 20 years it didn't work, then do you just say, okay, well, it's no longer worthwhile to help Afghans develop democracy? No, the thing is, up front, what you really should do, but you don't do it politically for exactly the reasons that Roosevelt articulated, is you don't say that this cause is worth it up to here, but no farther. You don't say, we're doing this on a coldly calculating basis. Americans don't respond to that, and ordinary people don't respond to that.
And of course, as FDR is this lying to the American people, and maybe it's a noble lie, but it's a lie. And then his critics, including Lindbergh, are pointing it out. Like, no, he's actually going to go to war, and we're not just lending them money. We're going to have boots on the ground. So they were trying to call it out, and it turns out they were right after all.
Yeah, but this is evidence of Roosevelt's political brilliance, or you could say evidence of his extreme shrewdness. That Lindbergh again and again said, I told you that Roosevelt was going to do this when he was saying he wouldn't, and he did. And then I told you he was going to do this, and he said he wouldn't, and he did. And even after sort of exposing Roosevelt's, we'll call it shading the truth to be charitable to Roosevelt, again and again, the American people still sided with Roosevelt, because what it comes down to is Roosevelt portrayed a vision that Americans found very flattering. Americans, you are great. The world needs you. It helped a lot that the United States economy at that time could afford to do all this stuff without diminishing the American standard of living. In fact, at that time, it even improved the American standard of living, because the preparing for war, the sending all these weapons to other countries, revived the American economy coming out of the Great Depression.
Another thing is random stuff reminded me of the modern era. And I don't know if you remember a few years ago during the Trump administration, I think it was Tom Cotton, somebody floated the idea of buying Greenland, I think it was.
Yeah.
And it turns out in this book, was it Lindbergh who thought that we needed to secure Greenland because that would be, if Germany could take that, then we might actually be in danger. But my details might be wrong.
It wasn't Lindbergh, actually. It was Roosevelt who declared Greenland to be part of the Western Hemisphere and Iceland to be part of the Western Hemisphere, because his argument then was, we will protect the Western Hemisphere. But so the isolationists are often portrayed as ignoring the world and just putting their heads in the sand. In fact, the typical editorial cartoon is an ostrich with a head in the sand. Lindbergh actually proposed a very robust philosophy of American defense. He said, we don't defend Europe, because if we defend Europe, we're responsible for whatever kind of government Britain has, or France has, or whatever country we're involved with. No, what we will do is we will defend a Western Hemisphere perimeter. So, and this was he was willing to sort of project and force American policy onto the countries. For example, he said, if the Canadians don't allow us to have military bases, air bases in Canada, well, we'll just force them to take them. And if the countries of Latin America want to form an alliance with Germany, we'll overthrow their governments. We won't let them do it. We will defend the Western Hemisphere. And this is where Lindbergh's expertise in aviation came in. Because one of the arguments that Roosevelt and the advocates of war kept making is, we've got these new weapons, these airplanes, and they render the United States suddenly vulnerable to attack from afar. And Lindbergh said, no, you don't understand the way the planes work. Now, this was in the days before anything like intercontinental bombers. He said, if anything, airplanes make America, the American continent, more defensible than before, because we can build lots of planes that can attack invading navies hundreds of miles before they get near American shores. And so, this idea that somehow we have to go fight in Europe because if the Nazis gain control of Europe, they'll send waves of airplanes against us. No, he said, okay, yeah, you can fly a plane from Europe to America. I flew it in the opposite direction, but I couldn't even carry an extra sandwich. Things have gone a little bit farther now, and they might be able to carry a few small bombs, but nothing that can actually have any real military impact. So, and this is where Lindbergh goes from being simply a celebrity. So the reason that the radio stations, and radio was the media of the day. So the reason that the radio stations would put him on the air was that he was a celebrity. He was probably the most famous American in the 1920s after his flight from the United States to France, crossing the Atlantic in one hop. But the reason that people listened to him was that he actually knew what he was talking about when it came to aviation, and he always focused his strategic arguments on aviation. And that's his one thing that he knew. And he knew better than anybody else the state of play in the air forces of all the major countries in the world, because they all invited him to come take a look at their airplanes, because he was the world's expert. And they hoped that they could, when he was in Germany looking at the German Air Force, they would try to get him to talk, well, what did you see when you observed the British Air Force? And likewise for the French. And so when Lindbergh wrote, he had a part-time position with the U.S. War Department, which is the predecessor of the Defense Department. And he would say, the British and the French, they're sort of acting big diplomatically. They're making all these promises diplomatically, but they don't have the military to back it up. They are going to get themselves in a war they can't win. And you know what's going to happen when they get in the war that they can't win? They're coming to us, and they're going to try to get us to bail them out the way we did the first time around.
Well, I think we've just scratched the surface, but very clearly, listening to this, I think folks could tell that it's more complicated and nuanced than they might have thought going in, and also that there are certainly parallels to today, and that this big question about what is America's role in the world, I think this is very thought-provoking and stimulative to read it. So, but before I let you go, what did I miss? Any final thoughts? Anything you want to leave us with?
I would say that get out and vote and weigh in. And when you vote, consider this question of what should the role of the United States in the world be? We got these two candidates, and the candidates are package deals. But this really is the first time where we're getting a chance to weigh what is the United States going to be doing in the world for the next 30 or 40 years. So, whatever your view on this is, think it through and then vote accordingly.
All right, get the book, everybody. It's called America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. H.W. Brands, thanks for talking.
Nice to talk to you, Matt.